Chapter 1. I cringed at the sound of shattering bone. Blood was everywhere. It spurted into the dust-filled air and spread across the front of his white Western shirt. Get up! For God's sake, get up! Rivulets of red trickled away from him, gradually soaking into the dry, cracked ground. Get up! Please get up! You have to get up! A bull's deadly hoof, backed by nearly a ton of force, had crashed its way through my husband's chest. Rodeo fans shrieked and tried to cover their children's eyes. Others fled the stands or stood frozen with shock. Some tried to climb into the arena, but the bull, snorting and wild with panic, kept them back. In slow motion, the clown sank to his knees, his mouth open in a silent scream. There was blood everywhere. I jolted awake. The dream was always the same, and I always woke with the same pounding heart and choking, powerless feeling of loss and grief. I didn't know if the accident had happened like I dreamed it because I hadn't been there. Worse than that, much worse, was that my last conversation with Kevin had been an angry one. I don't care if you ever come back from Amarillo, turned out to be my final words to the man I adored. Now I had to live with them. I rose from the bed and sat on the edge of it. That the crunching of bone could have been heard was unlikely, even if the crowd hadn't been screaming. But the bull's foot had crushed Kevin's chest. That much was true. And I supposed the only fact that mattered. It had been a gory scene. I had his clothes to prove it. Kevin was a rodeo champion who won trophies, titles, money, and other prizes. He could stay on a twisting, bucking bull past the required 8 seconds. His dismounts were usually made in a smooth, fluid motion, gaining him extra points in the scoring of the ride. Safe and smooth, baby, he'd say with a grin. And his rides had been until that day, when his spur had become entangled in the strap. When he slid off the back of the bull, it bucked frantically, dragging him sideways a couple of seconds, and then brought its hind legs crashing down. End of the ride. End of Kevin. And some days, it seemed it would be the end of me. I took his shirt out of the bottom drawer of the dresser and set it on my lap. At the funeral home, Kevin's things had been handed to me in a box. My mother tried to take it, but I'd refused to let it go. The blood on his clothes was all I had left of him. It was a stiff, rust-colored stain, but it held his DNA, and to me, right then, it was him. Eventually, I made a cup of hot tea, cooled it with a splash of Jack Daniels, and took it and the shirt onto my porch. I sat in a white wicker rocking chair and stared at a black hulk standing against a slightly lighter sky. Cimarron Mountain. The stars were a dazzling display, oblivious to human misery and heartache. I pulled Kevin's denim jacket around me, snuggled down into it, and eventually fell asleep like that. I didn't hear the insistent ringing of both my cell phone and my landline. Rico's! Someone was shaking my arm, and it was irritating as hell. When I opened my eyes, a giant man dressed in the deputy sheriff uniform was leaning over me. It took a moment to register. Rico's, I've been calling and thought something had happened to you. Why are you sleeping on your porch? His voice trailed away as he took in the bloody shirt on my lap. You have to stop this, Margarita, he said gently. I couldn't sleep. Why are you here? It's barely morning. Why is Kevin's shirt here? Why do you even have that shirt? I looked down at it. It was beautiful and had been perfectly starched and white before the bull ruined it. It was pure Pima cotton with a 1/4 inch white herringbone stripe and diamond-shaped, pearlized snaps up the front and on each pocket. I like this shirt, I said. Rico's, you've got to get a grip. Tell me how to do that. He slumped his big self into the chair next to me and sighed. I had that dream again, Barney. Yeah, I thought so. He glanced over at my mountain. The golden pink colors of sunrise were washing over its reddish spires and sheer rock faces. It was about as stunning as anything could ever be. I think I'm going to be all right. And then the dreams come, and I realize I'm not. You're okay, Ricos. The dreams knock you off track. That's all. One day, you'll stop having them. Time will take care of it if nothing else does. Meanwhile, you should stop handling that shirt. It's all I have of him, Barney. It's a bloody shirt, Ricos. But it's part of Kevin. The man you love is gone. It's been over a year. You can't tell me how long to be sad. Everyone says it's been more than a year, like I should be over it already. That's crap. Suddenly, Barney shot out of the chair. I came to get you because there's been a murder. Norma Bates was stabbed last night, and we've got to get over there right now. He frowned at his watch. The sheriff should be arriving in about 30 minutes. Norma Bates? Murdered? Are you sure it was murder? Well, not 100% until I see the scene, but people don't usually stab themselves in the heart, do they? Chapter 2. What do you want me to do, Barney? I pulled on a pair of latex gloves and swallowed the foul taste in my mouth. I was willing to do almost anything if I didn't have to look at the body again. I'd already thrown up once. Norma Bates was lying in a pool of blood in the middle of her filthy kitchen in a house that was incredibly hot. Too hot for working or moving. Too hot even for being dead. Would you sweep? Barney was lifting fingerprints from the area around the sink and didn't look up. It looks like mostly trash, but something useful might turn up. The floor hadn't been swept or mopped in 6 months at least. The dingy tiles were littered with bits of paper, spilled food that dried where it fell, and a few pieces of broken toys. An armless Shrek, a hairless, naked Barbie, and minuscule parts from matchbox trucks and cars. I set the sad toys on a far corner of the counter. They didn't seem pertinent to the murder, only proof the children lived there. I lifted a torn, partially crumpled photograph of a young Latino off the floor. His hair was black and shiny, and he had a been at the beach all summer complexion. The smile on his lips was seductive. This man knew he was a knockout. But his eyes were kind and somehow sad in spite of his movie star looks. The eyes, his best asset, were like gazing into an abyss full of stars. What are you looking at, Ricos? I matched the photo at the tear and held it in front of Barney. Do you know this man? He stood, slowly straightening his 6.5-foot frame from a crouching position, swiped his face across his shirt sleeve, and frowned at the handsome man. He's nice looking. I've never seen him before. You don't know him? I've never seen him either. He could be your brother. I don't have a brother. Barney sighed. I'm just saying he looks like you. He's Mexican. I'm half Mexican. Other than that, I don't see a resemblance. You're a hard-headed pain in the butt. What's your point? Skip it. Maybe Norma and another woman were fighting over him. Or Norma was having an affair with him and he got sick of her and stabbed her, I suggested. You really think a woman as unattractive as Norma could get a good-looking man like that even once? Good point. I found a broom and dustpan in a closet. I had to fight a big gray spider for them, but I got to work, meticulously sweeping from the line of blood outward. I tried not to look at the dead woman. She'd been stabbed in the heart, and a big, bloody stain had spread across her chest. The kitchen table had been shoved from the center of the room, where Norma now lay, to the far wall. One trap chair had skidded along with it, and 4 other chairs were toppled and lay askew, dead in battle. Utensils, pots, and pans were scattered, maybe thrown in a fight, an attack, or in self-defense. Knowing Norma, I'd guess she started it, but guessing is unacceptable in crime scene investigation. I had hated Norma Bates alive, but in death, she was somehow pitiful. What a bitch she had been. Now, she was a dead bitch. But since I was supposed to show respect for the victim, I kept my mouth shut. That wasn't hard, since Barney wasn't saying much. He was sweating profusely and concentrating on lifting prints. His uniform looked like he'd taken a shower in it. Occasionally, he'd straighten up, wipe his face, and curse with abandon. On another day, at a different scene, I might have laughed out loud, but this one wasn't funny. The whole thing reminded me of Kevin and the bull and the blood stain on his chest, the chest where I'd loved to lay my head. I took a trembling breath of air that was stifling and smelled of stale blood and filth. The Bates family lived off the grid and had solar power, but not enough to run anything to cool the place. There was only an oscillating fan that half-heartedly pushed against the hot air. Once the first pile of debris was swept up, I set the dustpan on the counter to examine the trash, using the pen from my pocket to move things around. There was dried macaroni, a few hairs, dust balls, scraps of paper, the crumpled photograph, some dried peas, and one earring. It was a gold hoop with a tiny heart in the center, and I'd seen it before, and recently, on my mother. My heart went into my throat. My mother did this? There's no way my mother could have done it. I lifted the hoop with the pen and studied it. I was sure it was hers, and it had been in the debris closest to the body. Should I leave it and let it become part of the evidence? Yes, of course. But I could take it and match it for certain to the other one, if I could find the other one. To take it would be tampering with evidence in a murder investigation, and maybe it wasn't even hers, except I knew it was. Sheriff Ben would flip if he ever found out I took it. I slipped it into my pocket, then took it out and started to put it back with the other trash in the dustpan. I glanced around like a shoplifter to see what Barney was doing, but he wasn't watching me. I slipped the earring back into my pocket. I wanted to grill Mom myself, or that's what I told my conscience. Sweat poured off of me as I swept up the rest of the kitchen. Afterwards, I stepped outside into the shade of a lean-to back porch. It wasn't much cooler, but the air smelled better and breathing was easier. I sighed and comforted myself with the breathtaking views in all directions, scenery that never failed me, even when everything else did. hazy mountains with bare cliff faces of red-brown rock, boulder-strewn hills that appear to be gently rolling, but are anything but gentle. In the Big Bend of Texas, nothing is as it appears. Bizarre shapes and show-off colors materialize as light floods the landscape. Things gleam for a while, then darken, change shape, move, and eventually disappear as the sun cuts its path across the sky. By the time darkness settles, you wonder if the whole scene wasn't just a trick of your imagination. Entire mountains come and go, as if by magic, or hang suspended above the desert. Distances are deceiving. In that strange rock formation 15 miles away, is that strange rock formation 15 miles away? Or 50? There are not many trees or shrubs to get in the way of the vistas, and on a clear day, it's possible to see 100 miles into Mexico. And the senses lie. From the vantage point of the mountains, the desert looks like a desolate moonscape. From the desert, the mountains seem bare. Neither is true. I looked around on the back porch, and then the rocky ground beside it. When that yielded nothing, I moved to the front of the house. There was a discarded cigarette butt and a crumbled, empty pack of Rojo's brand, manufactured in Mexico. Maybe it meant nothing, and could have gotten there 100 ways, but I put it in an evidence bag anyway. The cloud of dust coming my way was most likely my boss, Sheriff Ben Duncan, and I told myself to go back inside, but couldn't. He parked his Ford truck on the side of the road by the house and jumped down. When he noticed me watching, he smiled and waved. I hurried towards him. "How's it going, Deputy Ricos?" He extended his hand, and we exchanged hellos as if there wasn't a dead body melting into the floor. Then he began to walk towards the house. I followed because it would have been wrong to stand by the road the rest of the day. Sheriff Duncan is 6 feet tall. He's old, 60-something, yet doesn't seem old. He has broad shoulders and stands erect, which makes him seem younger. But he has an older man's tolerant attitude. His thick hair is wavy and completely white. He's been a lawman since he was 20 years old. I wonder if it wasn't his job more than age that turned his hair. I could almost feel mine going white when I thought of the close, hot smell of the blood in that dirty little kitchen. When we got to the door, Sheriff Duncan paused, removed his hat, took out a handkerchief, and wiped his brow. "Hot as hell," he said as he replaced the hat. "Is Barney in here?" "Yes, sir. He's still fingerprinting. I just stepped out for some fresh air." "It's hard, isn't it, Margarita?" "Yes, sir. Especially when it's someone you know, dying violently like that. She was a mom, too." I knew Norma's children would suffer because of her untimely death, and I felt sorry for them. Although I had wished death on Norma many times, seeing it happen to her was another thing. Sheriff Ben removed his sunglasses and wiped beads of sweat from beneath his eyes. I thought it was going to go badly for him in that kitchen. When he had stuffed the handkerchief back into his pocket, he held the door open for me. Our sheriff is a decent man and always treats me well. I'm one of the only 2 women in the sheriff's office, and the only one interlingual. Marcy and I take a lot of hassle from the guys, all of it behind the sheriff's back. The male deputies think we can't possibly be as good as they are. Only men should carry guns and hunt down criminals. Like, we all do so much of that. To them, we're either bitches or sex objects, and sometimes both. The sheriff treats us as equals, and he deals with us fairly. He's soft-spoken and old-fashioned in many ways, which totally annoyed me at first. Now, I've become more or less resigned to it. At least, he isn't like the deputies. I stood next to the sheriff. and felt the earring in my pocket. While he observed the victim, I moved sideways to the dustpan and dropped in the gold hoop, and then put the whole mess into an evidence bag. My mother would have to fend for herself. She's a grown woman, and I'm a professional law enforcement officer. Surely she could explain how her earring got to the scene of a murder. Damn, it's hot in here. Barney's roar shook the house as he came down the narrow hallway from the bedrooms. He wiped his face on his uniform sleeve and might have continued cursing, except that he saw our boss standing over the body. Yes, Deputy George, it certainly is that, commented the sheriff without looking up. Barney removed the glove from his right hand, and he and the sheriff greeted each other. Then my partner and I walked him through the Bates home. It was a mess, and there had been a violent struggle in the kitchen, but the house seemed more neglected than anything. Where's the rest of the family? Asked the sheriff. I see signs of a family everywhere, but no family. We don't know where they are, sir. Maybe they went to that Baptist church family retreat that started Saturday, Barney suggested. A lot of people were going. They don't go to church, I said. My partner glared at me. How would you know that? Because I know this family, Barney. Norma was very anti-organized religion. Actually, Norma was anti-anything in which she wasn't the focal point, but I kept that to myself. She wouldn't have been able to sit still in a church and let God get all the credit. Maybe she stayed home and the rest of them went, Barney said, overly patiently, as if I was mentally slow. He figured he was my superior because of his sex, an extra 4 years' experience in law enforcement work, and his formidable size. Did you call Chuck? Sheriff Ben asked Barney. Chuck is our Justice of the Peace. Our JP serves as a judge for minor traffic violations in small claims court. He also marries people and pronounces bodies dead in lieu of a coroner, since we don't have one. Yes, sir, said Barney. He'll be here any time. I notified the funeral home, too. Good, said the sheriff, and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed, waited, and then said, Guy? Sheriff Duncan. He was calling our constable. I'd like for you to come to the scene of a murder. He listened. Yes, a murder. He enunciated murder and rolled his eyes at me. That's right, interlingua. Do you know where the Bates family lives? Another pause. Yes, that's the one. I want you to guard the crime scene while I speak with my deputies about the investigation. Barney and I exchanged a glance. Sheriff Ben listened a bit longer. Thanks, he said. We'll be waiting. At that moment, our JP came through the door, preceded by his big paunch. He was an old guy and, unlike our sheriff, looked it. The clipboard of papers he carried seemed too heavy for him, in addition to the 270-some pounds he hefted about. He was out of breath and perspiring profusely. Hot today, he said, and tipped a blue Dallas Cowboys ball cap at me. Howdy, Chuck. Sheriff Ben stepped up to him, shook his hand, and then Barney and I followed suit. When Chuck saw the body and the blood, I think he considered bolting. What time do you reckon she died? He asked anybody. He did not touch or examine the body in any manner. Of course, there was no doubt about Norma's state. If anything, she looked deader than before. Barney considered. I'd guess between 8 p.m. and midnight, he said, judging from the blood and the amount of rigor. Chuck glanced at the watch on his chubby wrist. I'm pronouncing at 9:15 this morning, but I'm supposed to write the approximate time of death on here. Well, put 9:30 last night then, said Barney impatiently. I'm no expert on dead bodies. The sheriff and I glanced at each other. I thought he looked amused. I sucked on my bottom lip. Do you have what you need from here, Barney? Sheriff Ben asked after Chuck got out. Yes, sir. The sheriff was standing on the sink side of the body. I saw him looking at the various glasses and dishes that appeared to have been left there a while, judging from the greasy room temperature water that had started to stink. Let's wait outside, he suggested, and began moving towards the door. The three of us sat together at the edge of the porch, our feet dangling over low-growing inkweed and dog choyak cactus. It was still stifling, but there was a slight breeze from time to time that felt cool when it brushed against my damp uniform. If you can be out of the sun, then life is bearable in the desert. The sun is brutal. To the left, about 40 yards away, was a chain-link dog pen beneath a lopsided structure built for shade. Even the dogs looked miserable and barely barked at us. Did you have a look over there? Asked the sheriff, with a sweep of his hand in that direction. Yes, I said, but I didn't see anything that seemed like it would have a bearing on the murder. Things are scattered. They're weathered like they've been there a long time. I didn't think that surprised anyone. At last, the hearse arrived, and Barney and the sheriff went back inside to oversee the proper handling of the corpse. Sheriff Ben is a stickler for respectful treatment of the dead. While the men were inside, I took the opportunity to call my mother, Stephanie Ricos. She pretended not to know anything about the murder, or she really didn't know. I didn't know what to think. When was she murdered? She asked. Mom, when was the last time you were at Norma's? It's been at least 6 months, I guess. You're sure? Of course I'm sure. You realize that you'll be a suspect. Why would I be a suspect? You hated her. Everybody knows what she did to you. She did a lot of terrible things. A lot of people hated her. That's true, I guess. Are you at Norma's now? Yes. We're waiting on the constable. He's going to guard the crime scene while we have a meeting with the sheriff. Guarded? From what? From anybody who thinks about messing with it. Well, who'd mess with a crime scene? I don't know, Mom. Who commits murder inter lingua? She didn't have an answer for that. When the sheriff stepped back onto the porch, he looked towards the layer upon layer of rugged mountains stretching to the west. Wouldn't you think a man who lives 17 miles away would be here by now? Well, Sheriff, said Barney from behind him, maybe he was doing something important. I'd like to know what. Maybe you wouldn't, sir. The sheriff turned and gave Barney a look. I almost laughed out loud and had to suck on my lip again.